Man shoots entire family at their son's funeral. A man opens fire on his entire family during his own son's funeral service, sending dozens of mourners scrambling for their lives in absolute terror. But 3 years later, a hidden security camera reveals something so shocking that it completely rewrites everything we thought we knew about that horrific day. The morning of October 15th, 2019, started like any other autumn day in the small town of Bridgewater, Montana. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wood smoke from chimneys throughout the valley. But inside St. Mark's Methodist Church, an atmosphere of profound grief hung heavy in the air as friends and family gathered to say their final goodbyes to 22-year-old David Garrett. David had been the pride of Bridgewater, a young man who could light up any room with his infectious smile and boundless energy. He had just graduated from Montana State University with a degree in mechanical engineering and had his whole life ahead of him. The tragic car accident that claimed his life on a rain-slicked highway just 3 days earlier had sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of barely 2,000 residents. Nobody could have predicted what was about to unfold during what should have been a solemn ceremony of remembrance. Nobody could have imagined that within the span of just a few terrifying minutes, this quiet mountain town would become the epicenter of a case so bizarre and complex that it would challenge everything law enforcement thought they understood about human behavior under extreme grief. The church was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls and spilled out into the vestibule. David had touched so many lives during his brief time on Earth, and it showed in the overwhelming turnout. His high school football teammates sat together in their letter jackets, tears streaming down their faces. His college fraternity brothers had driven 6 hours from Bozeman to pay their respects. Teachers, coaches, neighbors, and family friends filled every available space. At the front of the church, David's mahogany casket was surrounded by more floral arrangements than St. Mark's had ever seen. White lilies, red roses, and yellow chrysanthemums created a beautiful but heartbreaking display. A large photograph of David in his graduation cap and gown sat on an easel beside the casket, his bright eyes seeming to watch over the proceedings with that same warm smile that everyone remembered so fondly. The Garrett family occupied the front pew on the right side of the church. 54-year-old Robert Garrett sat ramrod straight, his weathered hands folded tightly in his lap. As the owner of Garrett Construction, Robert was known throughout Bridgewater as a man of few words but strong convictions. He had built half the houses in town and had never missed a deadline or cut a corner in 30 years of business. Beside him sat his wife Catherine, a graceful woman of 51 who worked as the head librarian at Bridgewater Elementary School. Catherine had always been the emotional heart of the family, the one who remembered every birthday, organized every holiday gathering, and somehow managed to make their modest 2-story home feel like the most welcoming place in the world. Today, however, she seemed almost fragile, as if she might shatter at the slightest touch. Their daughter Nicole, 24 years old and a nurse at the regional medical center, sat on her mother's other side. Nicole had always been protective of her younger brother, and losing David had hit her particularly hard. She had been the one to identify his body at the hospital, a responsibility that would haunt her for years to come. The service began with Pastor Michael Reynolds delivering opening remarks about David's character and the impact he had made on everyone around him. Pastor Reynolds had baptized David as an infant and had watched him grow into a remarkable young man. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke about the cruel randomness of the accident and the mysterious ways that God calls people home. Several family friends and former teachers took turns at the podium, sharing memories that painted a vivid picture of a life well lived despite its tragic brevity. Each speaker brought their own perspective on David's kindness, his work ethic, his sense of humor, and his unwavering loyalty to those he loved. But as the service progressed, those sitting closest to the Garrett family began to notice something troubling about Robert's demeanor. While everyone else was openly grieving, sharing tears and comforting embraces, Robert seemed detached, almost absent. His jaw was clenched tight, and his eyes had a distant, unfocused quality that made some people uncomfortable. Catherine kept glancing at her husband with growing concern. She had been married to Robert for 28 years, and she had never seen him quite like this. Even during the darkest moments of the past few days, he had maintained his composure, handling funeral arrangements and logistics with his typical methodical approach. But something was different today, something that made her stomach twist with an inexplicable sense of dread. To understand what happened next, we need to examine the Garrett family dynamics in the weeks leading up to that fateful October morning. The Garretts had always been considered one of Bridgewater's model families, the kind of people who volunteered at church events, attended every school function, and were always willing to lend a hand when neighbors needed help. Robert had grown up in Bridgewater, the son of a cattle rancher, who had taught him the value of hard work and self-reliance from an early age. After graduating from high school, Robert had briefly considered leaving Montana for college, but when his father suffered a heart attack during his senior year, Robert chose to stay home and help manage the family ranch. When his father passed away 5 years later, Robert sold the property and used the proceeds to start his construction business. Catherine had moved to Bridgewater from Missoula after college, drawn by a teaching position at the local elementary school. She and Robert met at a church social in 1991, and friends later said it was love at first sight. Catherine brought out Robert's softer side, while Robert provided the stability and security that Catherine craved after growing up in a chaotic household with an alcoholic father. Their marriage had weathered its share of challenges over the years. Robert's business had nearly failed during the economic downturn of 2008, forcing the family to take out a second mortgage on their home and make significant lifestyle changes. Catherine had suffered 2 miscarriages between Nicole and David, losses that had tested their faith and brought them closer together through shared grief. David's birth in 1997 had been a source of tremendous joy for the entire family. Nicole, who had been an only child for 3 years, had immediately embraced her role as big sister with enthusiasm. She helped feed David, taught him to walk, and read him bedtime stories every night. The age gap between the siblings was just narrow enough that they could be genuine friends as well as brother and sister. As David grew older, it became clear that he had inherited the best qualities of both parents. From Robert, he got his mechanical aptitude and his methodical approach to problem solving. From Catherine, he inherited his easy social skills and his genuine concern for other people's well-being. Teachers consistently praised David for his kindness toward classmates, while coaches marveled at his natural athleticism and team-first attitude. Robert had been particularly proud of David's academic achievements. As someone who had never attended college himself, Robert saw his son's engineering degree as vindication of all the sacrifices the family had made over the years. He had attended every one of David's football games, helped him with math homework, and spent countless hours in the garage, teaching him how to work with tools and understand how mechanical systems functioned. The car accident that killed David had occurred on a Wednesday evening in early October. David had been driving home from Bozeman after visiting friends when his pickup truck hit a patch of black ice on Highway 12. The vehicle had skidded off the road and rolled 3 times before coming to rest in a drainage ditch. The Montana Highway Patrol determined that David had been traveling at a reasonable speed and had not been drinking. It was simply one of those tragic accidents that happen when autumn weather conditions turn deadly without warning. Robert had taken the news harder than anyone expected. While Catherine and Nicole openly wept and sought comfort in each other's arms, Robert had withdrawn into himself, becoming increasingly isolated and uncommunicative. He stopped eating regular meals, barely slept, and spent hours sitting alone in David's room, staring at trophies and photographs from happier times. Catherine had tried repeatedly to draw Robert into conversations about funeral arrangements and memorial services, but he seemed to go through the motions without any real engagement. When she suggested they might benefit from grief counseling, Robert had dismissed the idea with a curt shake of his head. When Pastor Reynolds offered to provide spiritual guidance, Robert politely declined, saying he needed to work through his feelings on his own. The morning of the funeral, Catherine had awakened to find Robert's side of the bed empty. She discovered him sitting in the kitchen, fully dressed in his black suit, staring out the window at the first light of dawn. When she asked if he was all right, Robert had simply nodded and said it was time to go say goodbye to their son. Something in his tone had made Catherine's blood run cold, but she could not have articulated exactly what frightened her about his demeanor. The turning point came approximately 45 minutes into the funeral service, just as Pastor Reynolds was preparing to deliver his eulogy about David's lasting impact on the community. Robert had been sitting motionless throughout the proceedings, his expression growing increasingly distant and troubled as speaker after speaker shared their memories. Without any warning or apparent provocation, Robert suddenly stood up and walked toward the front of the church. At first, people assumed he was going to add his own remarks to the service, which would have been entirely appropriate given his role as David's father. Catherine watched with a mixture of relief and apprehension, hoping that speaking publicly might help Robert begin to process his grief in a healthier way. But as Robert approached the podium, something in his posture and movement pattern triggered alarm bells for several people in the congregation. Pastor Reynolds later described a moment of intuitive dread, as if some primitive part of his brain recognized danger before his conscious mind could process what was happening. Robert stepped behind the podium and reached inside his suit jacket. In one fluid motion, he withdrew a chrome-plated revolver and raised it toward the congregation. The sight of the weapon sent a wave of horrified gasps and screams through the packed church as people suddenly realized they were witnessing something far beyond a grief-stricken father's emotional breakdown. "You all think you knew my son," Robert said in a voice that was eerily calm and controlled, completely at odds with the chaos erupting around him. "You think you understand what this family has been through, but none of you have any idea what it means to lose everything that matters." Catherine jumped to her feet, her face white with terror and disbelief. "Robert, what are you doing?" she cried out, her voice barely audible above the growing panic in the church. "Please put the gun down. This is not what David would want." Nicole had immediately dropped to the floor behind the pew, her medical training kicking in as she tried to assess the situation and determine the best course of action. She could see that several elderly congregation members were having difficulty moving quickly enough to reach the exits, and she knew that any sudden movements might escalate the situation into something catastrophic. "David is gone because I failed him," Robert continued, his voice growing louder and more agitated. "I failed as a father, and I failed as a husband, and I failed as a man, and now everyone is going to pay the price for my failures." Pastor Reynolds had slowly begun moving toward the side door of the church, hoping to reach a phone and call for emergency assistance, but Robert immediately swung the gun in his direction, freezing the pastor in place with a terrifying look of wild desperation. "Nobody leaves," Robert shouted. "Nobody moves. We are going to sit here, and we are going to talk about what really happened to David, and we are going to talk about what this family has been hiding from all of you." The next few minutes passed in a blur of terror and confusion. Dozens of people were trying to find cover behind pews, while others pressed toward the exits in a desperate attempt to escape. Children were crying, adults were screaming instructions to each other, and the sound of footsteps pounding across wooden floors created a cacophony of panic that could be heard for blocks around the church. Robert fired the gun 3 times in rapid succession, the deafening reports echoing off the church walls and sending everyone diving for cover. The shots appeared to be aimed over people's heads rather than directly at anyone, but in the chaos and terror of the moment, it was impossible for anyone to be certain of Robert's intentions. Catherine had crawled across the floor toward her husband, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded with him to stop the madness. "Robert, please," she sobbed. "David would never forgive us if someone gets hurt because of this. Please just put the gun down and we can talk about whatever is bothering you." "It is too late for talking," Robert replied, his voice now shaking with emotion. "It has been too late for talking for a very long time. David knew the truth, and now he is gone, and I cannot live with what I have done to this family." Nicole had managed to help several elderly congregation members find better cover behind a large wooden cabinet, but she could see that the situation was rapidly moving beyond anyone's control. Her father was clearly in the grip of some kind of psychological crisis, and she feared that any moment he might turn the gun on himself or others. Outside the church, the first police officers were arriving in response to multiple 911 calls from people who had escaped during the initial chaos. Sheriff's deputies surrounded the building and began establishing a perimeter while trying to gather information about what was happening inside. The standoff continued for another 27 minutes, with Robert alternately ranting about his perceived failures as a father and making cryptic references to family secrets that nobody else in the room could understand. He kept the gun trained on different sections of the congregation, creating a constant state of terror for everyone trapped inside. Finally, as police negotiators were setting up equipment outside and preparing to establish communication, Robert made one final statement that nobody present would ever forget. "I love my family more than life itself," he said, his voice breaking with anguish, "and that is exactly why I have to do this." He fired the gun 3 more times in rapid succession, apparently aiming directly at Catherine and Nicole. Both women screamed and collapsed to the floor as congregation members dove for cover, certain they had just witnessed a horrific murder-suicide attempt. The immediate aftermath of the shooting was a scene of absolute chaos and terror. Emergency responders flooded into St. Mark's Methodist Church expecting to find multiple casualties, while paramedics prepared for the worst-case scenario based on the frantic reports they had received from witnesses who escaped during the initial panic. What they discovered inside defied all expectations and logic. Catherine and Nicole Garrett were both on the floor, apparently unconscious but with no visible signs of gunshot wounds. Robert stood over them with the smoking revolver still in his hand, his face a mask of anguish and defeat. When officers ordered him to drop his weapon, he complied immediately, setting the gun on the floor and raising his hands without resistance. The initial medical examination of Catherine and Nicole revealed something extraordinary. Neither woman had been shot. Instead, both appeared to have fainted from shock and terror during the final moments of the confrontation. Catherine had a minor bruise on her forehead from hitting the pew when she collapsed, but otherwise both women were physically unharmed. Detective Lisa Morrison of the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office was assigned as the lead investigator on the case. Detective Morrison had 15 years of experience dealing with domestic violence situations and crisis interventions, but she had never encountered anything quite like what happened at St. Mark's Church. The physical evidence at the scene was consistent with multiple gunshots being fired. Detective Morrison later testified during Robert's sentencing hearing. "We recovered 6 spent shell casings from a .38 caliber revolver, along with impact marks on the church walls and ceiling that indicated where the bullets had struck." Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed that Robert had indeed fired 6 shots during the incident. 3 shots had been fired into the air during the early stages of the confrontation, apparently intended to intimidate the congregation and establish his control over the situation. The final 3 shots had been fired in the direction of his wife and daughter, but ballistics experts determined that the bullets had passed several feet over their heads before striking the wall behind them. Robert's behavior during police interviews was equally puzzling. He readily admitted to bringing the loaded weapon into the church and firing it multiple times during his son's funeral service. He expressed remorse for terrorizing innocent people who had come to pay their respects to David. But when investigators pressed him for details about his motivations and mental state, Robert's answers became increasingly vague and contradictory. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by grief and guilt following his son's death. Dr. Patricia Fleming, a forensic psychiatrist with over 20 years of experience, diagnosed Robert with severe major depressive disorder, complicated by traumatic grief reaction. Mr. Garrett was experiencing what we call complicated grief, which is a condition where the normal grieving process becomes prolonged and debilitating, Dr. Fleming explained in her report. In some cases, individuals with complicated grief may develop distorted thinking patterns and engage in behaviors that seem completely out of character with their previous personality. The legal proceedings moved relatively quickly, largely because Robert chose to plead guilty to multiple felony charges rather than contest the case in court. He was charged with 6 counts of aggravated assault, 1 count of reckless endangerment, and 1 count of disturbing the peace. The prosecutor, District Attorney Karen Walsh, recommended a sentence of 12 years in state prison, citing the severity of the crimes and the lasting trauma inflicted on dozens of innocent victims. During the sentencing hearing, several members of the congregation testified about the lasting psychological impact of the incident. Marta Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had been sitting near the front of the church, described ongoing nightmares and anxiety attacks that prevented her from attending religious services. Tommy Chen, a 12-year-old boy who had been at the funeral with his parents, required months of counseling to address symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Catherine and Nicole both provided victim impact statements that were heartbreaking in their complexity. While they expressed love and concern for Robert's mental health, they also acknowledged the terror and betrayal they felt during those horrific minutes when they believed he might actually kill them. "I have been married to Robert for 28 years, and I thought I knew him better than anyone else in the world," Catherine told the court through tears. "But the man who pointed that gun at me and our daughter was a stranger. I do not know if I will ever be able to trust him again, even though I still love him and want him to get the help he needs." Nicole's statement was equally moving. "My father was always my hero growing up. He taught me to be strong and independent, and he showed me what it meant to be a person of integrity. Losing David was devastating for our entire family, but what happened at the funeral made me lose my father too, in a completely different way." Judge Harold Peterson sentenced Robert to 10 years in the Montana State Prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 6 years. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Peterson acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the case, while emphasizing that grief could never justify terrorizing innocent people. "Mr. Garrett, I recognize that you were acting out of profound pain and mental anguish following the tragic death of your son," Judge Peterson said. "However, your actions on that October morning caused lasting trauma to dozens of people who were simply trying to honor David's memory. The court must send a clear message that violence is never an acceptable response to personal grief, regardless of the circumstances." 3 years and 4 months after Robert Garrett was sentenced to prison, St. Mark's Methodist Church underwent a major renovation project. The congregation had raised funds to update the heating and cooling systems, refinish the hardwood floors, and make several structural improvements that had been deferred for decades due to budget constraints. During the demolition phase of the project, construction workers made a discovery that would completely rewrite the official narrative of what happened during David Garrett's funeral service. Hidden behind a false wall in the church basement, contractors found a sophisticated security camera system that had been installed in the early 2000s, but had apparently been forgotten when the church's leadership changed hands several years later. The system included multiple cameras positioned throughout the main sanctuary, each connected to a digital recording device that had been quietly documenting every service, wedding and funeral, for over 15 years. Most remarkably, the system had continued operating throughout the entire period, powered by a backup battery system that recharged itself through a connection to the church's main electrical grid. Pastor Reynolds was stunned by the discovery. He had been serving St. Mark's for only 8 years and had no knowledge of the security system's existence. A review of church records revealed that the cameras had been installed by the previous pastor as a security measure following a series of break-ins, but the project had never been formally documented in the church's administrative files. "We had no idea that system was even there," Pastor Reynolds later explained. "The previous pastor had passed away several years before I arrived, and apparently the knowledge of the cameras died with him. If the renovation project had not required us to tear into that basement wall, we might never have found them." The implications of the discovery were immediately apparent to everyone involved. If the security cameras had been recording during David Garrett's funeral service, there would be definitive video evidence of exactly what had transpired during those terrifying minutes when Robert held the congregation hostage. Detective Morrison, who had since been promoted to lieutenant, was contacted immediately about the potential evidence. She obtained a search warrant within hours and personally supervised the extraction of the digital recording files. What she found on those recordings would challenge everything law enforcement thought they knew about the Garrett case. The security footage provided multiple angles of the entire funeral service, including crystal-clear images of Robert's breakdown and the subsequent standoff. But more importantly, the recordings captured audio of everything that was said during the incident, including statements and conversations that had been missed or misremembered by witnesses during the original investigation. The most shocking revelation came when forensic audio specialists enhanced the sound quality of Robert's statements during the confrontation. Using advanced digital processing techniques, they were able to isolate and clarify words and phrases that had been obscured by the chaos and panic in the church. What they discovered was that Robert's seemingly threatening statements had actually been desperate attempts to communicate something entirely different to his family and the congregation. His references to family secrets and failures were not the ramblings of a man having a psychotic break, but rather coded attempts to reveal a truth that he had been carrying alone for months. The enhanced audio revealed that Robert had been saying David knew the truth about the accident, and I could not save him because I was not there. These statements took on completely different meaning when viewed in the context of previously unknown information about the circumstances surrounding David's death. Further investigation revealed that David had called his father on the night of the accident, approximately 30 minutes before the crash occurred. The call had gone to voicemail because Robert had been working late at a construction site and had left his phone in the truck. David's message, which Robert had saved but never shared with anyone, contained information that recontextualized everything about the family's grief and Robert's subsequent breakdown. In the voicemail, David had said he was having trouble with his truck's brakes and was considering pulling over to wait for help. He had asked his father to call him back as soon as possible because he was nervous about driving on the icy roads with compromised brake function. If Robert had received that call and responded immediately, David might have avoided the accident that claimed his life. The security footage also revealed another crucial detail that had been overlooked during the original investigation. When forensic experts examined the revolver that Robert had used during the incident, they made a discovery that cast the entire case in a completely different light. The gun had been loaded with blank cartridges rather than live ammunition. Every single shot that Robert fired during the funeral service had been a blank, incapable of causing physical harm to anyone in the church. The loud reports and muzzle flashes had been real, creating genuine terror among the congregation, but there had never been any actual danger of anyone being shot. This revelation raised profound questions about Robert's true intentions during the incident. If he had wanted to harm his family or the congregation, he would have used live ammunition. Instead, he had carefully planned what appeared to be an elaborate and desperate cry for help, designed to force his family and community to confront the depth of his guilt and anguish over David's death. The discovery of the security footage and the revelation about the blank ammunition transformed the Garrett case from a straightforward account of grief-induced violence into something far more complex and heartbreaking. Robert had already served 3 years of his 10-year sentence when the new evidence came to light, prompting his legal team to file for sentence modification based on the changed circumstances. The legal proceedings that followed were unlike anything Gallatin County had ever seen. Robert's defense attorney argued that his client had never intended to harm anyone, and that the use of blank ammunition proved his actions were a desperate attempt at communication rather than genuine violence. The prosecution maintained that terrorizing innocent people with what appeared to be a loaded weapon was still a serious crime, regardless of Robert's ultimate intentions. Judge Peterson, who had presided over the original sentencing, agreed to review the case in light of the new evidence. After extensive hearings and expert testimony, he reduced Robert's sentence to time served plus 2 years of supervised probation, acknowledging that the original sentence had been based on incomplete information about the defendant's true motivations and mental state. While Mr. Garrett's actions were still inexcusable and caused genuine trauma to many people, the court now understands that his intentions were fundamentally different from what we initially believed. Judge Peterson explained during the resentencing hearing, this was not an attempted murder or a planned act of violence, but rather the desperate action of a man overwhelmed by guilt and grief, who made a catastrophically poor decision about how to communicate his pain. Catherine and Nicole's reactions to the revelations were complicated and deeply emotional. Learning that Robert had never intended to harm them provided some measure of relief, but it also raised difficult questions about communication, trust, and the ways that families process trauma together. "I am grateful that Robert never wanted to hurt us," Catherine said in a statement read by her attorney. "But I am also angry that he felt he could not simply tell us about David's phone call and his feelings of guilt. We could have worked through those feelings together as a family, without putting dozens of innocent people through such a terrifying experience." Nicole's response reflected her background in healthcare and her understanding of mental health issues. "What happened to our family shows how important it is for people to seek professional help when they are struggling with grief and trauma. My father's guilt over not being available when David needed him was eating him alive, but there were so many better ways to address those feelings than what he chose to do." The congregation at St. Mark's Methodist Church also struggled to process the new information about what had happened during David's funeral service. While some members felt relief that they had never been in actual physical danger, others argued that the psychological trauma they experienced was just as real regardless of whether the gun contained live ammunition or blanks. Pastor Reynolds used the situation as an opportunity to address broader issues about mental health, communication, and the importance of seeking help during times of crisis. He organized a series of community meetings where congregation members could discuss their feelings about the incident and work toward healing and understanding. "This experience has taught all of us that people in our community may be struggling with pain and guilt that we cannot see or understand," Pastor Reynolds said during one of these gatherings. "While we cannot excuse Robert's actions, we can learn from this situation and make sure we are better at recognizing when someone needs help before they reach such a desperate point." The Garrett family eventually began attending counseling sessions together, working to rebuild trust and communication that had been damaged by years of unexpressed grief and guilt. Robert's revelation about David's final phone call led to difficult but necessary conversations about the random nature of tragedy and the importance of not blaming oneself for circumstances beyond anyone's control. David's memory became a source of healing rather than division for the family. They established a scholarship fund in his name to help other young people from Bridgewater attend college, and they began participating in community programs focused on mental health awareness and grief counseling. 3 years after his release from prison, Robert Garrett still lives in Bridgewater, though his relationship with the community remains complicated. Some residents have forgiven him and recognize his actions as the desperate cry for help of a man overwhelmed by grief and guilt. Others maintain that terrorizing innocent people is inexcusable regardless of the underlying motivations. Robert now works as a volunteer with local mental health organizations, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale about the importance of seeking professional help during times of crisis. He speaks regularly to groups of people dealing with grief and trauma, emphasizing that there are always better alternatives than the destructive path he chose. "I will regret my actions for the rest of my life," Robert often tells these groups, "not just because of the fear and pain I caused to so many innocent people, but because I almost destroyed my relationships with the family members I have left. Grief and guilt can make you feel like you are drowning, but there are people who can throw you a lifeline if you are willing to reach out and grab it." The account of what happened at St. Mark's Methodist Church on that October morning serves as a powerful reminder that human behavior is often more complex than it initially appears. It challenges us to look beyond our immediate judgments and consider the pain and circumstances that might drive someone to make choices that seem incomprehensible from the outside. Most importantly, it reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when grief and guilt threaten to overwhelm our judgment, there are always people willing to help if we have the courage to ask for it. Sometimes the most important conversation is the one we are most afraid to have, and sometimes the strongest thing we can do is admit that we cannot handle our pain alone. If this case has resonated with you, or if you know someone who might be struggling with grief, guilt, or mental health challenges, remember that help is always available. Sometimes reaching out for support is not a sign of weakness, but rather the first step toward healing and hope. The next time you see someone whose behavior seems inexplicable or concerning, consider that there might be a deeper pain or struggle beneath the surface. We all carry burdens that others cannot see, and sometimes the difference between tragedy and healing is simply having someone who cares enough to listen and understand. What other true crime cases have challenged your assumptions about human behavior and motivations? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more deep investigations into the complex psychology behind real criminal cases that shaped communities forever.